Hello, and welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today the Poison Pen is blessed to have with us author Kimberley Woodhouse, whose new book is A Gem of Truth. Before we begin our chat today, I would like to let those tuning in know that the Poison Pen does have copies of Kimberley's new book on order, and we would be delighted to hold one for you or put one in the mail. It's real easy. Just give us a call at the bookstore or go online, and we would be happy to connect you with this fabulous book. And now I'd like to welcome Kimberley.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm always fascinated by authors, what their life was like before they were writers. Many of them have such interesting backgrounds. Yours was especially intriguing. Can you tell us a little bit about Kimberley before she became a writer?
I was a musician my entire life, and that had been my focus. And since I was 3 years old, lessons and competitions and concerts and, everything for my entire life. In fact, my goal had been to go to Juilliard, and I had a scholarship to Juilliard. And then, just things changed. And I went to a small college to study under a man who was from Juilliard. He had contacted me. And so I went completely to study under him and met my husband the first day. So I thought that was a really cool thing that happened. But music has always been a huge part of my life. But I think a lot of us creatives are also very musically inclined, or we do other arts and crafts, that kind of a thing. And so it wasn't until one of my professors in college, my English professor, he told me, he goes, "You are a brilliant storyteller." And I thought, oh, okay. Yeah. I was a music major, wasn't thinking much of it, but I'd always loved to read, just been passionate about books. I devoured books, loved and loved to read. So years later, when my son was born and he was sick, so I was up with him all night, I needed to get rid of all of the creative stuff that was coming out, and I started writing stories, but I didn't tell anybody for years. It was kind of funny.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, it wasn't until you were challenged by somebody that you actually began the formal process of getting a book into publication.
That is correct. I had a friend who literally was in the other room. She was supposed to be helping me pack, and she was in the other room reading stacks of the manuscripts that I'd written, and she came in with this huge ream of paper and hit me over the head with it. And she said, "If you don't do something with this, I'm going to kill you." So
in the best possible way.
Yes, in the best possible way.
Let's talk a little bit about your new book, which is A Gem of Truth. What can you tell us about the book?
I am super excited about this book. And it's interesting that this one is book number 2. A lot of times it's book number 1 that is the inspiration for the whole series, but it was actually this one. And it was back in 2008. I was at the Grand Canyon with my kids back when they were teenagers. And I remember seeing one of the interpretive signs that talked about the Spanish that came in the 1540s. And that was, the modern day discovery of the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
And it was very fascinating to me reading this whole history. And then I went home and I started researching on it. And I was like, oh, I'm totally going to play with this and do something. And so it created in me this legend that is fictional in the story, but it's based off of the real history and the real people in 1540 on that Spanish expedition and why they came, because they were looking for the cities of gold. And so I created a legend, and that just kind of spurred everything on. And my heroine is a liar. Nicely, she's always been a storyteller because she had some trauma very early in life. And so she's always told stories, and she's hunting for the treasure, and the hero is a jeweler.
It's a fascinating book. She's a Harvey girl. Can you tell those who may not be familiar with that whole idea what Harvey girls were?
Yeah, in fact, there's some really great history of Harvey houses in Arizona, which is just, there's an entire book, it's just about the Harvey houses in Arizona. But Fred Harvey was a brilliant man. He was just brilliant. And if we, I've gone to marketing classes where they talk about the fact that they give credit to modern day marketing to Fred Harvey way back when. And also, restaurants and the food industry, they credit everything back to how Fred Harvey did things. And what he did was he went to the railroad, he approached them, and he asked if he could have restaurants and little hotels along the way, along the railroad line. And that way people could be fed really good, decent meals, and they'd have good places to stay, because before Harvey came along,
Mhm.
people would
Was
get really sick because the food was so bad, along the way. And or they had to pack their own food, that kind of a thing. So it was really difficult travel before he started doing this. So the Harvey houses had been along the rail line for quite a while by the time this series starts, and it's at El Tovar, which is
Mhm.
on the rim of the Grand Canyon.
Mhm.
And it was the crown jewel. So for a Harvey girl to actually get to be there was very prestigious. It was great for her to get that wonderful thing. We're going to transfer you, to the El Tovar. So they were trained meticulously. They had curfews, they had all of these rules that they had to follow, and they never spilled a drop. They didn't drop, if they got anything on their apron, they had to change. Everything was just pristine. And as the train went, if it was a lunch meal, where the passengers got off and had to get back on, they had 45 minutes to serve a beautiful, decadent, elaborate meal in that short amount of time before the passengers had to get back on the train. Now at the El Tovar, it was more of a destination location. So it's a little bit different with the Harvey girls in it, but it's still the same wonderful concept of these women who, we have to credit them with settling the West. This
Mhm.
is how men got wives and developed families and everything. As the train went west, the Harvey houses went and the Harvey girls went.
And this was the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line that they
Yes,
were.
yes.
I think it's also a credit to, I mean, I was fascinated by what you put into the book, but in many ways for women, this was also an opportunity because other than being a school teacher or other things, you didn't have that many career opportunities in the West.
Right. There weren't many career opportunities, I think, at all, much for women back then, especially things that would be looked upon as a good job
Mhm.
where they didn't get
Yeah,
a bad, reputation for
as
it.
opposed to a soil dove or someone
Right.
like that. Yeah.
Yes. So Harvey was also brilliant in that, in giving women a shoe up in doing something that was reputable and honorable. And they made a good amount of money. And that was really great for these women. And yeah, the majority of them did get married, along the way, but some of them stayed as Harvey girls for the entirety of their career.
Mhm. Um, it's also fascinating when you're reading historical fiction, at least for me, discovering all these little details and you think, okay, is this real or is this something,
Yeah.
kind of is put into the story to give the illusion? And you had so many things that were interesting, like the cup code. Was that actually a real thing?
Yes, the cup code was a real thing, especially along the train lines, because that was how they stayed efficient and how they moved fast. Up meant coffee, down meant tea. And so then they could, move through there swiftly and refill people's drinks.
And I'm sure you used a lot of different, I mean, you visited the Grand Canyon, as you mentioned, but what other sources did you use? Were like their diaries or letters, or how did you go about getting the feel for the era?
There were a ton of books that I was able to find, and then I found some experts. That's my favorite part, is to always go to locations and find experts. And so when I went back to the Grand Canyon, when I knew I was going to write this series, I actually met some people at the El Tovar, and there was a historian there who'd worked there for 40 years. And I got some wonderful information from him. And then I also was connected with one of the universities there in Arizona, and they had all of the documents of a man who spent his entire life researching Fred Harvey. And his goal had been to write a book.
Mhm.
But sadly, he passed away before he was able to do that. So the university has all of his papers and journals and everything. So I hired, somebody from the university, and I said, hey, can you dig through the boxes, and see what I can find. And, I told him this is what I'm looking for and this is what I'd like to know. And always using the historian's rule of three, meaning
Oh,
that, we don't want to use something unless we know we've got three substantiated sources, that show that it's correct. Because as you well know, we can look up anything online and find all
mhm.
kinds of interesting answers.
That's fascinating. I have never heard of the rule of three. That's
Yeah.
interesting to know. Um, there's other things too, like there was a photographer, and I'm probably getting it wrong, the Kolb brothers or Colby, or
Kolb, yes, the Kolb brothers.
and they actually people they would pay them to take their pictures or things like that, or
Their history is fascinating. In fact, if you go to the Grand Canyon, you can go see the Cole Brothers studio, which is still standing, and they've expanded it. And it's actually from the original house that the Cole Brothers built they built it on the very edge. I mean, the very edge of the canyon. So a lot of people get a little squeamish when they go, because it's like, oh, I don't want to fall in. But they have videos and all kinds of stuff. They were brilliant. They were daredevils, but they were brilliant. And I have several of their pictures of things that they would do just to get a shot. There's one of them where they're between two in a crevasse, and one of the brothers is on a log holding a rope while the other brother is being lowered down with a camera so he can get a shot. And they did stuff like this all the time and would ask people to pose for them. And they made an agreement that they would take the toll for the Bright Angel Trail if the man who owned it, would allow them to build a house. They built a house, and then they would take people's photographs before they started and sometimes along the way. And they would actually run down the Bright Angel Trail and back up several times a day to get to the water so they could develop pictures, and they would have them back up at the top by the time people returned from their little trip.
And if you're not familiar with the Grand Canyon, some people take like several days just to get to the bottom of the canyon. So that's a feat.
Yes, it's quite a feat. And the fact that they did it so many times in a day, it just blows my mind. But they kept doing it until there was water sources at the Grand Canyon.
One of the other fascinating things you included in the book was an actual menu. I think it was for breakfast. I can't remember because my mind's not always the greatest, but the things that they were serving, they were really fancy, I guess is the word I want to use.
They were elaborate. They had amazing meals. And that's actually from a menu that's actually still there at El Tovar that you can see it, in a glass case. They have several of them that are there, but the dining room is incredible. It's still pretty much the same, except for the part that they have expanded. I think that's to the west, but the dining room is still the same, other than the fact that some of the tables are square and round. They used to be all square. And so it's pretty fascinating to go in there because you get the vibe. You can walk right in and go, oh, this is exactly, how it was before. And you can envision the Harvey girls in their black dresses and their white aprons, just gracefully gliding through the room and serving the people. And one of the men that I met that had worked there for 35 years, the beef stroganoff that they serve is a recipe that they've been serving since the beginning. And I thought that was really neat.
It's amazing. One of the other threads to your story is also the jewelry, the gem business, which comes up in the title. Your hero is involved with that. What kind of research did you do into that? Were you always fascinated by making jewelry? Because there's a lot of stuff in there about how you went about in the early 20th century doing that.
Well, it's kind of funny how things, happen for us authors. Like this trip back in 2008 when my kids were teenagers, I just started thinking, of all these cool things, what kind of stories could simmer, taking place in the Grand Canyon? Because I just thought it's such a grand, majestic location. I've got to write books here one day. And I was fascinated with the El Tovar and the Harvey girls. Well, the next year I was in Alabama on a book tour, and my best friend from college, one of her family members actually owns a jewelry store. And I needed, something fixed on my ring. And I had gone in and, most people are fascinated with the glittery, pretty, whatever's in the shiny cases. And I said, hey, can I look at the workroom? Because that's just where my brain goes. And he took me in the back. And it was so incredible to see. I mean, just tables upon tables with tools and workbenches and all this stuff. And so then my brain is going, oh, how does all of this work? And then I asked him, I said, well, what would the tools have been like 100 years ago? And he said, that's the cool part. He said, they're all the same.
Oh.
He said, we might have electricity on, this one over here, but it was pedal, driven back then. He said, but jewelers' tools have not changed. And so that just all kind of sparked together and made Chris, who is the jeweler, and I was fascinated with that. And another friend of mine in Colorado is a master jeweler now. So I constantly picked her brain, and she had to send me 5 million pictures of stuff as she worked on it, and showed me how different things were used and how the tools were used and what all the names were. And so having people that were experts that were able to help made it that much fun. But lapidary is really cool. So then I got to research how stones were cut back in the 1500s, because I wanted to use that as part of the treasure that I created for my little fictional legend.
That was fascinating. Did the El Tovar and the places that Fred Harvey ran, essentially, you have the jeweler kind of making things on commission to sell. Was that part of what they also did back then in the hotels and the restaurants?
They were very good at welcoming the native people everywhere that they were. And so the Hopi House, was built at the same time as the El Tovar. And they wanted to have the real Hopi people living and working there so that people could learn, about the culture and all of that. And there were several locations that they used other local artisans, to do stuff that they would sell at these places that were by the Harvey houses. So that is actually true. I don't know if they actually had a jeweler come in, like I have in A Gem of Truth, but all of it is based on historically what Harvey did with his restaurants, and then like the Hopi House at the Grand Canyon.
Which in some ways is a credit to him, because that was not something everyone did back then. They were taking these Native Americans seriously as
they were.
Yeah.
And the Native people were very appreciative of it, of their culture, because as we all know, there were a lot of things that we as a country did wrong with the Native people that were here. And that was something that I think Fred Harvey did well in honoring these people. And a lot of times it was giving them jobs and giving them a way, to make a way out of poverty, when a lot of them had been kind of restricted to small areas, and it was serious poverty. So it was a really cool thing what Harvey did. I always think that he was a man, ahead of his time.
This is the second book in your series, Secrets of the Canyon. So there's the first. Can you tell us just a little bit about that? And I guess we can guess, since it's a trilogy, I'm sure there's another one coming.
Yes. So A Deep Divide is book number 1, and it just won the overall novel of the year from the Christian Market Book Awards out of all categories. And
Congratulations.
I was blown away. Thank you. Just was such a thrill for that to happen. But it actually has an heiress in it at the very beginning, and she is running away and hiding her identity. And I can't give you spoilers. You'll have to read the book for why she's running away. But I love Emma Grace. That's the heroine in that story. I love her story. And Ruth Aniston, who is the head waitress in books 1 and book 2. She's a very prominent character in both books. I've had readers clamoring ever since A Deep Divide came out. They wanted Ruth's story. And I said, well, just wait, because Ruth's story is book 3. So there's quite a sacrifice that's made in book 2. And that unconditional love and that sacrifice really changes her life. And in book 3, that's Ruth's story.
That's coming next year.
In January, yes.
January, not that far away. Let's talk a little bit about your writing process, because that's fascinating too. Authors have such distinctive approaches when they start stories. In particular, this is a trilogy. Did you know when you first started out it's going to be 3 books, or did that kind of evolve along the way? And if so, how do you build these characters that show up in book 1 so that they have their own story in book 3? So I guess talk about your writing process and how connected books can affect you as a writer.
Sure. I actually did plan it as a 3-book series, because I had in my mind the actual stories. I knew the basics of what, book 1 is kind of the one that I had the most fleshed out and plotted. And I had the basic ideas for 2 and 3, but they really grew as I was writing book 1, and I knew exactly what was going to happen at that point in books 2 and 3. So I have 5 books releasing next year and 4 books the year after that. So I do write a lot, and this is my full-time job. So it's pretty busy. I'm normally balancing, several books, writing one and editing another, planning on another, researching another one. So that's how I divided my day. But normally it's things like this that have been simmering in my mind for a while. Like this series, it started in 2008 and it didn't become the full ideas until 2018. It was quite a bit of time that these ideas will just kind of simmer back there. I keep a creative journal, and so I talk about that when I teach classes. And in the creative journal, I'll jot down these ideas, and you just never know when one's going to bubble up to the top and start simmering, or a new piece of research will fall into place, and you're like, oh, this is what I needed, for the story. Kind of like the Grand Canyon, it all started, and the next year, seeing the jeweler's workbench, that all just kind of fell into place, and I knew what I wanted to do along the way. So I know everybody is a little bit different in their process, but I write a long synopsis for each one, and I research for about 6 months. And then when I write each book in about 6 weeks, and then I go through all the editing processes after that.
You've been writing for quite a while, and you have a number of books to your credit. Knowing what you know now as a writer, if you could go back to when you were first starting out, what would you tell yourself as an author?
I think the fact that I call it a turtle race. Publishing is not a fast business. And if you want to do it well, I think, consider yourself a turtle in a turtle race, and realizing that it's just discipline and sticking with it and keeping going. And I don't think I had the outlook at the very beginning that it was all going to happen overnight, because I had plenty of mentors who helped me through the process. But understanding that it is the discipline of it, because a lot of creative people, that's what they struggle with, is discipline. And so, because it's easy to go, oh, a new idea, and get distracted by whatever, else has caught our attention. But I always tell writers, especially people who want to be published and they want to write books, like, you've got to stick with it. You've got to constantly work on your craft. I'm constantly reading books on the craft and going to conferences and taking classes and learning, because even though I'm writing my 35th book right now, I still feel like a newbie, and I know that I've got to keep learning, because everything changes. Society changes, technology changes, the craft changes, the rules change over time. And so I think just keep learning, and slow and steady wins the race.
Yeah, I think I actually had written down, you had said something that writing is not something you can learn overnight, which I think is very true. Even authors who have been writing for 20 years, 30 years, things do change, and you have to kind of embrace that. You also have to be open to new things.
So true. Yes.
Before we run out of time, and we're rapidly approaching that point, how can readers learn more about you and your books? Are you on particular social media outlets? Do you have a website?
I do have a website. It's just my name, KimberleyWoodhouse.com. And even if you spell it wrong, it should still take you there, because I think I own all the domains, all the different spellings. So it should be easy to find me. And there it has all of the links for Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and YouTube and all of the fun places there. And my blog and my newsletter are there. So I love interacting with readers. I love meeting readers. And this past year I was just at StoryFest, which is a reader interactive community. And next year I'll be at the Mississippi River Readers Retreat and Fiction Reader Summit and StoryFest again. So just, wow. I love meeting the readers and getting to know you guys. It's really great to connect with you.
Well, that's wonderful. I did have one question when I was looking at things about you. Somewhere I found that you're a third-generation List student. Yes. I'm guessing that refers to the musician, but what exactly is that?
So the technique that I was taught is the Franz Liszt technique that he passed on to his students. And so my students, I have taught music lessons for 30 some odd years. I don't teach very many now since I write full time. But I teach the Liszt technique. I passed that down. So now they're fourth generation.
Wow.
Liszt was a phenomenal virtuoso and just incredible, and his technique was brilliant. So it was a proud day to be able to study under a Liszt student.
I had no idea. I mean, he was kind of like the rock star of his time period, but I didn't know his own technique. I can't believe how quickly this time has flown by. The Poison Pen has been very fortunate to have Kimberley Woodhouse here, whose new book is A Gem of Truth. And I'm delighted to hear there's the third book coming next January. And congratulations on the well-deserved award for the first in the series.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's a mark of grace. I should have said that. A mark of grace is book 3. That's in January.
We'll look forward to that. I want to thank Kimberley for taking time to visit with us today, and I want to thank everyone who took time to listen in to another virtual author event at the Poison Pen Bookstore. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.